Okay, folks, I'd like to call to order the meeting of the Municipal Audit Committee, and I'd like first of all to hold hands and say, let's start with introductions with
David Ryan, Controller.
Adam Tromley, Assembly.
George Vitalis, Municipal Manager.
Harriet Drummond, Assembly Member of the Audit Committee.
Paul Holman, City.
Bobby Gray Jackson, Audit Committee Chair.
Mark Hall, Anchorage Fire.
Mike Chadwick, Internal Audit.
Jay Shin, Internal Audit.
Cheryl Fasca, OMB.
Lucinda Mahoney, CFO.
And as you probably know, the reason why we're here is to go over the E911 audit, and as the audit committee, it's our responsibility, if I see an audit that I think needs further discussion, to have that further discussion. That's why we're here today. And so I'd like to start the meeting off with, I forgot your name.
Mike Chadwick.
With Mike, who's sitting in for Peter Raskin, to just go over the audit report, the findings, and the recommendations to the administration. Thank you.
Sure. The objective of this audit was to determine whether the enhanced 911 or E911 surcharge revenue was used for eligible expenses according to Anchorage Municipal Code and Alaska State Statute. On page 2 is our first finding, where we found that some of the costs charged to E911 revenue were questionable. We found that they may not be appropriate because they were not for the maintenance or operation of the E911 system. These costs included emergency business phone lines, cell phone services, internet services, long distance charges, mobile internet, satellite phone services, and then pagers, radios, and other telecommunication devices. We recommended that the enhanced 911 revenue should only be used for costs directly attributed to the establishment, maintenance, and operation of the E911 system. On page 5, we have our second finding, where we found that E911 surcharge revenue was not restricted at year end. The revenue left over at year end was closed out to fund balance instead of reserved to cover allowable E911 expenses. You'll see on page 6 where we have E911 surcharge revenue and year end balances, and this data was obtained from the Office of Management and Budget. The recommendation is the controller should ensure that E911 revenues are restricted to only costs of the E911 system. On page 3, we talk about the surcharge and that it may require adjustment. Our audit revealed that the $1.50 surcharge may be excessive since revenue in each of the last 4 years has exceeded costs. And in addition, as we said, we identified some costs that were charged to not relate to the E911 system. And we recommend that APD and AFD, in conjunction with the Office of Management and Budget, should consider revising the E911 surcharge to match allowable costs. And that is the conclusion of the report. We had 3 findings.
Okay, thank you very much. At this point, I'd like to hear from management on both sides as necessary, both police and fire, in response to the findings and recommendations, and probably an update from when this audit was completed. Who wants to go first?
Actually, I'll lead the discussion.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay. Based on the work that was done by the audit department, what we did was we evaluated each of the findings and did an analysis that went into more detail in terms of determining, what really is the fund balance situation associated with the E911 revenues. And what we did was we looked at the work that was done by the audit department, and we just sharpened our pencil a little bit more and gathered more detailed information to really understand what the true expenses are. And so what I'm going to do is pass out the analysis that we did and then share with you our conclusions. First of all, what we did was we got Chief Hall and Chief Mew together with us so so that we could better understand the operations of the 911 dispatch center. And we talked with them so that we could understand really what are the costs associated with supporting E911. And what we did is we established a methodology that was provided by each of the chiefs to identify the cost structure. What we did was we identified what that was in regard to both revenues and expenditures from 2010 back to 2004. And as we all know, fund balance, which is what we're talking about here, is accumulation of either surpluses or deficits over a period of time. So in summary, what this indicates is that going back to 2004, on a cumulative basis, based on our analysis of the costs, we are actually in a negative fund balance situation here of $7.5 million. And what I'd like to do is just share a little bit in terms of how we accumulated these costs so that you could understand where we're going. But before I do that, I want to indicate that we recognize that we need to set up a special fund or a special account to manage this in the future. Right now, we're doing some allocations between some of our departments, and what we want to do with our new or what we plan to do with the new SAP system is to set up more detailed accounting so that we can manage this much better.
I have just one really quick comment, and I'm sure you're going to explain this, but I just want to say this. Okay, so what you just said is that you found that instead of it being a $3 million surplus in that fund, it's a $7 million loss?
Yeah.
Really? Okay, thank you.
What we did was we looked at how much time the fire department and the police department spend on E911, and we talked with Chief New and Chief Hall about that. And what these numbers here represent is, from the police department's perspective, 49% of their communication department supports the E911 call center. So the numbers that you see on this page reflect that 49%. For the fire department, we worked with Chief Hall, who gave us the information here to help us understand how much of his communication department supports E911. And he indicated that, his staff over there, that is their sole purpose, is E911. However, we recognize that there are going to be other things that they do that are not that. Chief Hall indicated that he thought that the number was probably closer to 80%, but to be conservative and for purposes of this spreadsheet, we used a 75% cost number. So what this means at the end of the day is when you look at the revenues that are generated, less the costs, a lot of our E911 support really is funded through tax dollars. Because there's not enough revenue generated to support the E911 program on a standalone basis. So, anyways, but we need to go ahead and set up a fund, which we're doing. Actually, not a separate fund, but a separate way that we can track this in the future. Because right now, we had to go through this manual spreadsheet to make this happen. So anyways, that's all.
Does anybody have any questions?
I do, but I don't know what they
I
are.
got a question.
Yeah.
How does this kind of stuff happen? Why does it take this long to figure out that there's $7.4 million deficit? That's a lot of money.
I think, Adam, before, if I may, before
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
question is answered, I want a little more clarification for everybody on that deficit, because it's not it's not a literal, if you will, deficit. It's just comparing what it costs to do business and what we're collecting in money. So I wanted to be really, really clear that the city's doesn't have $7 million hanging out there that we got to cut and find. Yes, that's what I wanted to make clear before Adam got his question answered. Thank
No,
you.
yeah, and I understand that. It just seems to me that
And I also believe that because in 2004, the surcharge was 50 cents. And so, and then in 2005, when it was increased, it was effective in September. So there was about a quarter of the year that it was at this higher cost. So I think that contributes to the lopsided nature of this early on. And then it carries forward.
I mean, but what this tells us at the end of the day, though, is our current surcharge, if anything, is too small. And it is not something that we should look to be reducing. If anything, we should be look to increasing the surcharge. Although I am not stating that we should take some initiative to do that, but just based on the numbers, there's no justification for decreasing it.
And so there's never been an analysis done like this, I guess, to really show, because, bottom line is what we have before us in this audit is we got a $3 million surplus. Now we're finding, oh, no, it costs this much money to run this program. And the reality is, if you want to talk about deficit and surplus, reality is, no, we got a $7 million surplus. But did you have a comment?
I was going to say, that's exactly what our audit report is pointing out in finding 3, is that an analysis needs to be done. There hasn't been something done for
Right.
a number of years. And when there's nothing done, you result of these types of issues. For example, when this was, the chart we have here shows AFD costs at about 30%. So when analysis is done, we find that it's gone from 30% to 80%. So when you do these things, then that's part of the reason of the adjustment of these numbers. This was at 30%.
And personally, I think going from 30% to 80% is a really big jump. You know, it really is.
Chief Paul address that.
It's really big.
We have 20 dispatchers, and their sole job is to come to work and sit at that station, and they dispatch calls and take calls. They don't do filing, they don't leave, they are there, and that is their sole purpose, is to administer the 911 system. I venture to say 100%, quite frankly, because that's all they're hired for. However, I understand that on the side of being safe, going down to 80%, I'll live with that. 75, I'll live with that too, but that is their sole purpose in life, is to answer calls and dispatch.
Which I understand, that's why they're hired for dispatch. But to me, my concern is, the auditor is finding 30%, and then all of a sudden it's 80%, and that's a concern for me.
But if I could,
Sure.
if I could see if I could clarify this a little bit. So if you look at how the dispatch is sent up, all calls coming into the police department, okay? Now, some of those calls are administrative type calls. Some of them come through the E91 or the 911 system, period. Any call that goes to the fire department comes from that 911 system directly to them, and they respond to them. So even though his folks aren't totally dedicated to the 911 system, his folks receive all the information through the 911 system. And they receive very few outside administrative calls. Hardly any. No one calls the fire department. They call 911, transmitted him. He reacts, 911 dispatches. So that's why there's a difference between the two. And that's why there's a higher 911 rate per employee in the fire department than there is in the police department.
And that makes so much sense, George. Thank you for clarifying that. So what's the percentage in the police department?
Well, we estimated 49%.
49, okay.
I'd like to even back up further and put some context to this, if I could. You all, hopefully everybody here remembers the E911 related tragedy of about 2001. I never want to relive anything like that again, so I'm very, very protective of this system. When I got back and started getting used to what things had changed and so forth, because I was gone for 6.5 years, one of the things that came to my mind is I'd like to find out how we're doing on 911. So I asked for this audit. Okay, I didn't suspect something was wrong, but I wanted to know, and I want this audit done about every 3 years forever. Okay, so this is just us trying to take our temperature and see where we are. Now, there was a time when fire didn't get any of this money. All the surcharge revenue came to the police department, and we spent it ourselves. About the time I was leaving, fire department was saying, hey, can't we get in on a little bit of that? We're handling some of your calls. Well, actually, everything they get, as George just said, really comes through the 911 system. we let them in to the tune of about 30%, I guess. And over time, they've said, well, maybe we ought to have a little bit more than that. And so, the discussions have changed and over time, and I guess we took another look at it, and we're thinking now 75% is a better way to talk about that. But that comes out of the audit. I mean, the audit generates the discussion that helps us kind of set those levels.
Thank you. Did you have some questions, Ms. Jones?
Well, I'm thinking, as Chief Hall said, if 20 dispatchers do nothing but E911, their cost ought to be in the fire department.
Yes, ma'am. But
Simple.
it comes out of my operations.
Whether it's 30% or 80% or 100%, if that's what E911 is, then that cost needs to be there. Is it?
No, it comes out of my operating budget. There's not enough collected to pay them 20.
Anything that we
Yes,
don't pay
it's
for out of the
supported.
911 surcharge revenue, we just pay for out of our operating budget. So we try and estimate going into the budgeting process what that balance should be so that it adds up to 100%. But we get close some years. Some years we're a little over, some years we're a little under.
Mr. Honing?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Then, I guess I'd like to know if from the audit side, since the audit was done, using your analysis, I believe it's 3 years.
For the revenue?
Yes.
We used 4 years, and we obtained that data from the Office of Management and Budget.
Okay. So how then do we show a deficit? And I understand, Mr. Mahoney, you said that we did a sharpening of the pencils. I'm hoping what I'm hearing is that there's data that wasn't captured in your audit that is now. I'm thinking that's what I'm hearing, rather than a revisionist budget kind of situation. I'm just saying it out there because it just seems what I'm worried about. I guess I'm concerned with is how do we have such a wide disparate number here?
We're using the same data set for the most part, I understand. But they're using a data set that's capturing 80% of the costs. And OMB used a data set that captured 30% of fire's costs. So that accounts for that difference, for a large part of that difference, I suspect.
But also, Madam Chair, I mean, it's because this goes back to 2004.
And yours goes back to 2004.
All right, and so
correct.
why is it, what, was there a criteria that you, or what criteria did you use to just go back to 2007?
We went back to 2007. Do you remember, Jay, why we went back to?
I think it was Pete's election.
I think it was Pete's election who has us just go back to 2007.
Okay.
Going back to 2007.
Whose election?
Pete, we made a decision how far back we should go.
Oh, you said Pete's election, I'm going, I went somewhere else.
That's the same as Peter's choice?
But let me point out one thing that, and I'm not certainly an expert in this, but when I look at this, I have to wonder a little bit that if we're allocating 80 or 75%, whatever it is, to the costs of the E911 system, before this state law was implemented for E911, enhanced 911, the mill rate, I believe, paid for everything. The intent of E911 was to fund the enhanced portion. I recall, not to necessarily fund the entire portion.
That is correct. That is the information that I was actually the point of contact at the department for E911, and I remember having to use that as an explanation to folks who call upset about why that certain was on their phone bills.
Does anybody from the administration want to respond?
I'm not sure I understand. I helped rewrite that statute in the 2001 timeframe and broadened it to include all kinds of things in the dispatch center that come out of 911. So paint on the walls, carpet on the floors, radios for the people who dispatch, things like that were, I mean, initially maybe so, but the statute's been broadened. So today we can use those expenditures for things other than just the difference between the original 911 system and the E911 system. It's how we define the system, and the way we try to define the system now is all the stuff from beginning of call to to officer getting the radio, or fire department firefighter getting the radio signal, anywhere in between that is a part and piece of the E911 system. We expanded the definition of system and statute, is what I'm trying to say.
Thank you, David. You had a comment?
I got a portion of the statute in front of me, so I'll just read some
Thank you.
parts of it. It starts with saying, when it gives the explanation of the costs that are included, it says, the surcharge revenue may be used for the following costs to the extent the costs are directly attributable to the establishment, maintenance, and operation of an enhanced 911 system. So in the body, it says enhanced. And when it goes down to the explanations, it says, the salaries and associated expenses for 911 call takers for that portion of time spent taking and transferring calls. So when it gets to the body, it goes from saying enhanced 911 to this 911. And just coincidentally, we've been working on the GASB 54 analysis that we're doing a work session on next week. And this came up as an issue that we might have to restrict that money for CAFR purposes. And we asked legal for an opinion on this, and they said because it says 911 in the body, all 911 costs are eligible. It also goes further on to say that a definition of a call taker means a person employed in a primary or secondary answering point whose duties include the initial answering of 911 or enhanced 911 calls and running the calls to the agency or dispatch center responsible for dispatching, and it goes on. But when when I sat down with both Chief Hall and Chief Mew, and we kind of looked at the expenditures, and Chief Mew, his staff has done a very, very good job of analyzing their costs. And when they say 49%, that's a really good number. When we talked to Chief Hall, he's absolutely right. His argument was that 100% of his costs should be included, and we decided, because we weren't exactly sure of the legislation, and when it talks about a call taker is at 100%, we ended up just bringing it back to 75%. I believe it probably should be 100%, but we think because of the way the statute is written that we're fairly comfortable with our assumptions on our expenditures.
Thank you, Dave. Because I was just going to say the same thing.
Thank you. Do you want to respond?
Well,
I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
No.
I'm really not.
I think it deserves further clarification, quite frankly. I think the intent was to have to fund an enhanced portion. But that's just my personal opinion. That's not an auditor opinion.
But you did get the legal.
We talked to
opinion.
legal.
We got a legal opinion, yes.
Yeah, but we know you can get legal opinions for.
Well, let me
Same
suggest,
thing with audit
let me
opinions.
suggest this, because I don't really, we don't really have any staff. The assembly, what we have is specified for certain duties, okay? So I can't ask somebody to do that, to look into it, but how about if you do that?
Sure.
You look into it when it changed, and intent, and maybe some AMs and stuff, and provide that information? Because that would be really great.
Okay.
Thank you. Ms. Drummond, did you have anything you wanted to say? Does anybody else have any comments? Adam? Anybody else?
Well, when internal audit is reviewing it, I encourage them to look at the state statute, which authorizes the charge. So, that's the governing document.
Sure, that's what he was just reading.
As opposed to, right,
Correct.
as opposed to AMs and AOs.
Sure.
And just one further point, on GASB 54, when we look at whether we have a surplus or not, the state statute would probably override the municipal ordinance on how we handle it for capital reporting purposes.
Yeah, fortunately, I'm familiar with GASB 54, and you're exactly right.
I'm going to make you a lot more familiar next Friday.
Well, I work
so-
for the city of Acton, and we had to deal with
Oh, you've already been
54, and
through
I
it.
asked for this work session.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. But anyway, all I want to say is that I'm really thankful that we were able to get together and talk about this, because it deserves some further conversation. And I'm really glad to see from reading the audit that some of the audit findings in terms of purchases that were made didn't seem to relate to the E911 program, really do. The surplus, if you will, revenue was a real issue for me, and I appreciate the explanation that was put forward, and also appreciate the clarification that we don't have to find $7 million worth of cuts. And with that said, if no one else has, okay.
If you notice all the zeros on fire, 2004, 2005, is there any chance that we could get some money?
Yeah. And also, I want to.
In your dream.
One last comment before we adjourn, folks, please.
On record.
One last comment before we adjourn. I'm really glad to be reminded that an annual review of the 911 costs is supposed to happen according to the code, and I thank you for doing that.
We want to keep on top of this. Way too important to let it slide.
And frankly, I'm glad we don't have to ask the taxpayers for any more money. I'm glad we don't have to give back any. So, thank you for being here. The meeting's adjourned.